Chapter 22 The 12 Caves and the Sons of Jacob. I don't know how much of this I actually believe. I only began looking into these ideas because I do not think the scrolls originated at Qumran. Based on several internal indicators, it seems more likely that they were discovered in Egypt some 50 years earlier. My working theory is that they were later placed in the caves so that they could be found, serving as a kind of propaganda piece, possibly orchestrated by occult-leaning figures to give the modern state of Israel a stronger historical and religious claim to the land. As for the idea that the 12 caves correspond to the 12 tribes of Israel, that is more of a playful observation than a firm conclusion. It may have some significance, or it may simply be coincidence. So if I begin to sound like a lunatic in this chapter, I am fully aware that some of these ideas wander into speculative and occasionally very stupid territory. I am just pointing out a pattern, and if it's just a bizarre coincidence, then it still doesn't hurt anyone to point it out. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is usually told as a pastoral accident story. Shepherd boys tossing stones, startled goats, and the happy chaos of archaeological. Yeah, let's try that again. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is usually told as a pastoral accident story. Shepherd boys tossing stones, startled goats, the happy chaos of archaeology stumbling into history. It is a charming narrative, and like most charming narratives, it functions best when not examined too closely. When the discoveries are treated as isolated moments, randomness feels plausible. When they are viewed collectively, however, chance begins to look suspiciously well organized. Why are there 12 caves? Or, a better way to put it, what are the chances? Why not 11 or 13? Once that number is allowed to sit in the center of the discussion, the story changes tone. The caves stop behaving like geological quirks and begin to resemble components in a system. 12 caves correspond neatly to the 12 sons of Jacob, the structural backbone of Israel's identity. The parallel is not subtle, and it does not require a strained imagination. It emerges naturally the moment the material is viewed as a unified corpus rather than a pile of unrelated finds. This chapter does not claim that the caves were originally carved, selected, or stocked with the scrolls, according to the ancient master plan. That argument would be unnecessary and frankly far too easy to attack. Instead, the focus is on the final form of the narrative, how the caves were numbered, how their contents were emphasized or downplayed, how significance was distributed, and how the story of Qumran was ultimately stabilized for public consumption. Architecture, after all, does not require that every brick understands the blueprint. It only requires that the finished structure obeys it. Whether this structure emerged through conscious design, institutional habit, symbolic institution, or retrospective organization is almost beside the point. The result is the same. The Qumran caves, or respective. Ugh, we skipped the line. The Qumran caves function as a numerical map of Israel itself, a spatial echo of a genealogical system that has governed Jewish identity for millennia. The caves do not merely contain text, they arrange meaning. In the cult, Hermetic, and Kabbalistic systems, such correspondence are not esoteric flourishes added for decoration. They are functional mechanisms. Number is not number is not an illustration of meaning. It is the means by which meaning is fixed, transmitted, and made authoritative. Sequence matters, placement matters, repetition matters. Once these elements are in place, interpretation narrows, memory stabilizes, Ambiguity is demonst- is domesticated. The number 12 occupies a special role within the symbolic logic. It is the number of governance: 12 tribes, 12 months, 12 gates, 12 stones, 12 administrators of order. 12 is how a collection becomes a polity. It is It is how raw peoplehood becomes structure. In numerological systems, 12 does not describe who a people are, it describes how they are organized, regulated, and made legible. Seen in this light, the 12 caves of Qumran read less like a coincidence and more like an interface. They transmit history into structure. They take text, messy, fragmentary, contradictory, and embedded with them within a framework that feels inevitable, ancient, and complete. The caves become chapters in a numerical story, one that does not argue for authority so much as assume it. This is not storytelling in the ordinary sense. It is system building, and systems once established have a way of explaining themselves. Cave 1, Joseph. Cave 1 stands apart from all the other Cave 1 stands apart from all the others, and it does so loudly. It is the cave everyone knows, the cave that anchors documentaries, museum exhibits, coffee table books, and origin myths. If Qumran has a front door, this is it. The first cave discovered becomes unsurprisingly the interpretive lens through which all the others are viewed. That alone grants it a kind of narrative sovereignty, whether or not it deserves it. Its contents only reinforces the effect. 7 original scrolls, approximately 7 manuscripts. These numbers do not merely decorate. Let's try that again. 7 original scrolls, approximately 70 manuscripts. These numbers do not merely decorate the story, they stabilize it. 7 governs completion, legitimacy, and sacred authority across biblical and Near Eastern tradition. 70 governs totality, nations, elders, councils, and fullness. Together they create the impression of wholeness and authorization, the sense that what has been found here is not partial, not marginal, but foundational. And yet, this is precisely where the symbolism becomes interesting. Reuben was Jacob's firstborn, by birth order only, by birth order alone. Authority should have rested with him. Instead, Reuben loses the right of the progenitor through the moral failure. Genesis 49, verses 3 through 4. The firstborn status is not erased, it is redistributed. The double portion is given to Joseph, whose 2 sons will later function as tribes in their own right. Cave 1 is the beginning of a larger pattern that we are going to unfold. By itself, I would not give it a second thought, but with the further unfolding, the numbers 7 and 70 may hold more symbolic meaning than what we will get into here. 7 being the number of the scrolls found in jars, and 70 being the total manuscripts found in Cave 1. But like I said, we are not going to go further on that as we start speculating about the meanings of numbers, it just becomes a mess, and it becomes very difficult to not sound like an imbecile. Cave 2, Simeon. Cave 2 yielded 33 manuscripts. Whenever we encounter the number 33, some immediately think of Freemasonry. In this instance, it may very well be coincidence, but it provides an opportunity to clarify something important about numerology. I often compare numerology to buying a new car. The moment you purchase a particular make and color, you suddenly begin noticing that same car everywhere. It feels significant, but in reality, your awareness has simply been heightened. The same psychological effect occurs with numbers. Once you are told that certain numbers carry hidden meaning, you begin to see them everywhere, and it becomes easy to assign significance where none originally existed. Now, for the sake of argument, let's entertain the hypothetical that Freemasonry were somehow involved. It would not be unprecedented for organizations to embed symbols or markers within what they created. Advocates of this view often point to the street layout of Washington, D.C., which forms the pentagram, and a different set of streets forming the square and compass, or the Eye of Providence on the back of the U.S. dollar bill, sometimes associated with the Illuminati. Whether one accepts those interpretations or not, the broader point is that groups have historically used symbols to represent themselves. That said, numerology itself is a deeply subjective exercise and encourages people to notice what fits a preferred pattern and to ignore what does not. With countless numbers available and endless ways to manipulate them, meaning can almost always be manufactured if someone is determined to find it. Cave 3, Levi. Cave 3 would correspond with Levi. If there were any meaningful connection, it would likely center on themes of priesthood and religious authority surrounding the temple. Notably, this is the cave many scholars argue contained materials originating from the temple itself. It is also the cave that produced the Copper Scroll, the document often said to describe the hiding places of temple treasure. And, and once again, numerology enters the discussion. 15 scrolls were discovered in the cave. 15 scrolls were discovered in this cave. In 1QS, chapter 8 through 1 through 3, we read, quote, "In the council of the community there shall be 12 men and 3 priests, perfectly versed in all that is revealed of the law, those whose works shall be truth, righteousness, justice, loving kindness, and humility. They shall preserve the faith in the land that with steadfastness and meekness, and shall atone for the sins by practice of justice, and by suffering the sorrows of affliction." End quote. 12 men and 3 priests, 15 leaders in total, 15 scrolls in Cave 3. The parallel is easy to draw. Whether that alignment is meaningful or coincidental depends entirely on one's interpretive framework. For those inclined towards symbolic readings, the connection may appear deliberate, especially given the priestly and temple-oriented theme associated with both Levi and Cave 3. Others would caution that this is precisely how numerological reasoning operates. It notices alignment and assigns intention. There is also the additional question of chronology. Some have suggested that the structure described in the community rule, 12 leaders, let's reread that. There's also the additional question of chronology. Some have suggested that the structure described in the community rule, 12 leaders and 3 in a distinct priestly role, could be seen as a mirroring the structure Jesus established with the 12 apostles and the 3-member inner circle of Peter, James, and John. If that parallel were intentional, it would raise the possibility of literary or structural dependence, and thus the question of another example of anachronism. Whether coincidence, symbolic design, or later literary development, K3 remains as one of the more intriguing examples of how numbers, text, and interpretation intersect. K4, Judah. K4 dominates the Qumran landscape. It is not merely the most productive cave, it is the gravitational center of the entire corpus. Hundreds of manuscripts, many of them biblical, emerge from this single location. The sheer volume of fragments ensure that Cave 4 quietly dictates the counters of modern scholarship, that what survives most abundantly becomes what is studied most intensely, and what is studied most intensely becomes what is treated as normative. Judah, within Israel's tribal structure, is a tribe of rule, kingship, prominence, and authority. Flow through Judah, culminating in the Davidic line. Judah is not simply prominent, it is determinative. When Judah speaks, the system listens. K4 mirrors this role exactly. Its material overwhelms the others, not by argument, but by presence. It does not need to justify itself, it dominates by mass. Yet, the manner in which this dominance has been framed in the modern period introduces troubling layers of symbolism. On the official Dead Sea Scrolls digital archives, K4 material is distributed across 666 photographic plates, at least as of March of 2026. This is not a neutral stopping point. It is not a round number. It is not dictated by the logic of preservation or digitalization. It is a decision, a choice that freezes presentation at a number already heavy with symbolic freight. The scripture 666 is inseparably tied to kingship and wealth. It is the annual amount of gold received by Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 14, a figure that encapsulates imperial splendor, accumulation, and the seductive excess of royal power. But scripture does not allow the number to remain neutral. Revelation 13:18 reclaims it as the number of the beast, a symbol of corrupt authority, counterfeit rule, and power divorced from God. To assign this number to cave 4, the cave associated here with Judah, is therefore not merely ironic, it is inverted. Judah represents legitimate kingship, covenantal authority, and messianic promise. To frame Judah's textual dominance within the numerical boundary of 666 overlays that promise with suspicion. It recasts kingship not as rightful rule, but as something tainted, excessive, and ultimately hostile. The precision of the number makes it impossible to shrug off. Why 666? Why not 665 or 667? Why allow the archive to settle at a figure so symbolically loaded? Within a symbolic or occult framework, with such precision is not accidental. Numbers are chosen because they say something. They frame interpretation before a single word is read. Whether this framing was deliberate or unconscious does not alter its effect. The association subtly reframes Judah's dominance as dangerous. Too much text, too much authority, too much influence. Kingship becomes something to be managed, watched, and implicitly distrusted. Within the numerical architecture emerging across the caves, this is the critical moment. K4 is where authority peaks and where it is simultaneously problematized. Judah reigns, but under a shadow. This is not neutral cataloging. It is symbolic curation. And in systems governed by numbers, curation is power. K5 Dan. K5 yielded relatively little material with its association with Dan. We will speak of in a moment. In cave 6, Naphtali. Naphtali is scarcely described in scripture, associated primarily with swiftness and speech, Genesis 49:21. Cave 6 otherwise contributes little to the overreaching corpus. The correspondence here is thin, but the biblical science surrounding Naphtali makes the lack of a strong association unsurprising. Cave 7, Gad or Dan. Cave 7 is small, strange, and disproportionately disruptive. It contained only Greek texts, a fact that immediately sets it apart from the rest of the Qumran corpus. 24 manuscripts were found, which is also the same number of the Greek alphabet, in a collection otherwise framed as resolutely Jewish and deeply tied to scripture in its Semitic languages, this is not a minor curiosity, it is a rupture. Greek, in this context, is not merely a language, it is a cultural marker. It signals Hellenization, translation, mediation, and audience. Its presence raises questions about origin, function, and intended readership. Questions that do not arise with the same force in the other caves. Cave 7 does not simply add variety, it introduces a foreign register into the system. Officially, Cave 7 occupies its place in sequence and is therefore aligned with Gad. Gad, however, has no strong or enduring association with Greek culture, language, or transmission. Biblically, Gad is defined by territory and warfare, by borders and conflict, not by me- mediation or translation. The pairing works only if one is determined to preserve the numerical order at all costs. Under an occult or symbolic logic, however, Cave 7 seems misfiled. Its contents align far more naturally with Dan. Dan has long carried associations, fair or otherwise, with the Greek world, most notably through speculative connections to the Danaans of Homeric tradition. These links are not academically orthodox, but they persist in symbolic and esoteric literature because they feel right within certain mythic frameworks. Dan is the tribe of ambiguity, absence, and later displacement. Greek fits that profile unnervingly well. The anomaly deepens when the biblical ordering of the sons is considered in Genesis 35:22 through 25. The list of Jacob's sons is arranged in such a way that at a glance lead a lead a careless reader to miscount Dan as the seventh son. Under ordinary circumstances, such a mistake would be trivial, hardly worth mentioning, but in a system allegedly structured around symbolic precision, a misalignment at precisely this point is a stretch. If the cave if the caves are being remembered and framed through numerical architecture, Cave 7 is where the architecture creaks. Either the symbolic mapping slipped or the official ordering conceals a different logic beneath the surface. The Danites were not geographically the land given to the tribe of Dan. Many of them found the city of Dan in the land of Naphtali, it's very well it's it's very well possible I am missing a piece of the puzzle. With that said, systems built on numbers are not supposed to be sloppy, and yet here sloppiness appears to be an option. Yet a third option is that the caves were not found and labeled in their intended order. I am not trying to prove there is some kind of occult pattern. There I am trying to show that there are a number of anomalies and coincidences that appear as if there is a pattern, and if there is a pattern, it suggests someone constructed it. Whether Cave 7 belongs with Gad by sequence or with Dan by symbolism remains unresolved. What is clear is that exclusive its exclusively Greek content is not easily explained within a purely archaeological framework. It demands symbolic accounting, so we note the anomaly and for now we run with it. Either the symbolism faltered here or the numbering tells a story we have not yet been taught to read. Cave 8 Asher, Cave 9 Issachar, and Cave 10 Zebulun. These caves occupy a quiet middle of the system. Like the tribes that correspond to, they are present, necessary, and largely unremarkable. Scripture often Scripture offers little sustained narrative attention to Asher, Issachar, or Zebulun. Their roles are not dramatic, their identities are functional rather than formative. The caves reflect this resignment. Each contributes material, but none reshapes the corpus. There are no defining anomalies, no dominant text, no symbolic excess demanding interpretation. The correspondence is, on the surface, bland. Symbolic systems are not built entirely out of spectacle. They require negative space, areas of relative silence that allow emphasis elsewhere to register. If every cave were saturated with meaning, meaning itself would collapse under its own weight. These caves perform the same role as their tribes. They stabilize the structure without calling attention to themselves. They fill out the map, they complete the count, they remind the reader that order depends as much on restraints as on prominence. In a numerical architecture, science is not absence, it is a structural support. That is not to say that there is not anything symbolic that connects each tribe to the corresponding cave. I just couldn't be bothered to look any harder. Cave 11, Joseph, second portion. Cave 11 stands as one of the most significant locations in the Qumran system, rivaling Cave 1 in symbolic primacy and K4 in textual importance. It yielded substantial and influential material, including a large psalm scroll alongside other major manuscripts. This is not peripheral content, it is formative, devotional, and central to Israel's religious imagination. Within the numerical architecture emerging across the cave, Cave 11 does not function as an afterthought or appendix, it functions as a return. Joseph's role within cave with Israel's why am I saying Israel? Joseph's role within Israel's tribal structure is defined not by kingship but by multiplication. Through Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph received the double portion, an expansion that allows his presence to be felt in more than one place at once. His authority is not con- concentrated, it is distributed. Joseph does not rule the system, he frames it. The framing appears twice. First, indirectly, at the beginning, Cave 1 establishes primacy without prominence, or without I can't read that. Authority that is present but displaced. Abundance that gestures forward rather than settles. Then, explicitly, at Cave 11, where abundance reappears in a mature and stabilized form, what was implied at the threshold returns near the end as substance. The symmetry is difficult to ignore. Joseph's influence bookends the system, not through numerical sequence alone, but through structural echo. Cave 11 does not replace Cave 1, it completes it. Together they form a pair, beginning and return, promise and consolidation. This pattern reinforces a crucial insight. The system is not linear, it is architectural. Meaning is not exhausted by order of discovery or numerical position. Authority moves, reflects, and reappears. It is mirrored across the structure rather than stacked in a straight line. Cave 11 makes visible what the earlier caves have been preparing the reader to see. Power within the system is not monopolized, it is shared, distributed, and reinforced through symmetry. Joseph does not stand at the center, he surrounds it. And in a structure built on number, what frames the system ultimately governs how it is read. Cave 12, Benjamin. Cave 12 is defined not by what it contains, but by what it does not. It was looted before its contents could be properly recorded, leaving behind little more than traces and inference. In a system otherwise obsessed with preservation, cataloging, and enumeration, this absence is jarring. The final cave offers silence. Benjamin occupies a similarly precarious position within Israel's tribal memory. At the end of the book of Judges, the tribe is nearly annihilated following intentional conflict in Judges 20:21. Benjamin survives, but barely, and only through extraordinary measures. Its continuation is marked not by triumph, but by trauma. Survival itself becomes the story. Cave 12 mirrors this legacy, and bleh, Cave 12 mirrors this legacy with unsettling clarity. The cave exists, its presence is acknowledged, yet its substance is missing. What remains is the knowledge that something was there and is no longer accessible. The parallel is difficult to ignore. Loss, loss, erasure, and endurance through absence rather than abundance. Within the within the numerical architecture of the caves, this ending is conspicuous. Systems built on number typically conclude with closure, completion, harmony, or return. Cave 12 offers none of these. Instead, it leaves the structure unresolved. The count reaches 12 by but meaning thins rather than accumulates. The system ends with not with fullness, but with depletion, not with revelation, but with a gap. And in symbolic frameworks, gaps are rarely accidental. Absence can function as a boundary, a warning, or a memorial. Cave 12 does not complete bleh. Cave 12 does not complete the map of Israel, it scars it. The final note of the system is not possession, but loss. 40 years of gatekeeping. Following their discovery, the Dead Sea Scrolls did not move quickly into the open scholarly commons. I can't read today. Instead, they entered. Actually, I can't read any day, but I especially can't read today. Instead, they entered a prolonged period of restricted access, remaining largely under the control of a small circle of scholars, many of them afflicted with Catholic intentions for roughly 40 years. The wider academic world and the public were asked to wait. This delay is often explained in practical terms: the fragility of the material, the difficulty of reconstruction, the complexity of publication. These explanations are not without merit, but explanation does not exhaust symbolism, especially when the duration itself mirrors one of the most symbolically structured numbers in biblical imagination. 40 is not simply a measure of time, it is a measure of suspension. Israel wandered 40 years in the wilderness before entering the land. Moses spent 40 days on Sinai before descending with the law. Elijah journeyed 40 days before reaching Horeb. Jesus fasted 40 days before beginning his ministry. In each case, 40 marks a period of testing, withholding, and preparation, a threshold between promise and fulfillment. Placed against this background, the 4 decades of restricted access take on a narrative quality of their own. The scrolls are discovered, but not revealed. Knowledge exists, but it is not yet distributed. The land has been seen, but not entered. The effect is not merely delay, but ritualized postponement. Once again, the number does more than measure duration. It frames expectation. It teaches the audience how to interpret the waiting itself, not as obstruction, but as necessary probation. Authority remains centralized. Access is deferred. Meaning is controlled until the proper moment of release. Whether consciously enacted or unconsciously inherited, the pattern holds. The scrolls pass through a symbolic wilderness before they are allowed to enter the scholarly land. The delay becomes part of the story, not an embarrassment to it. In systems shaped by number, time is never neutral, it is curated, and 40 as ever signals that revelation is being managed. Why construct such a narrative? The more productive question is no longer whether these patterns exist, but why a narrative would be preserved in a form so densely structured, so numerically ordered, and so symbolically consistent. At this point, Hermetic principles are not decorative reference, they become necessary analytical instruments. Hermeticism does not treat number or structure as metaphors layered into reality after the fact. It treats them as the conditions by which reality itself is apprehended, stabilized, and transmitted. The first Hermetic principle, mentalism, states the all is mind, the universe is mental. In practical terms, this means that reality is not foundationally material but conceptual. Structures precede events, frameworks precede narratives, meaning is imposed through patterns through meaning is imposed through patterned thought before it is experienced as history. Under this principle, mapping Israel's tribes onto physical caves is not. Let's try that again. Oh man. Under this principle, mapping Israel's tribes onto physical caves is not storytelling, it is world building. It is the externalization of an internal schema. Once the mental architecture is established, the material details fall into place almost automatically. The second principle, correspondence, declares as above, so below. As above, as below, so above. This is the engine that allows symbolic systems to function across layers of reality. What exists in the abstract must be mirrored in the concrete. What exists in heaven must be reflected on earth. What exists in idea must appear in form. The 12 tribes above demand 12 loci below. The structure is not optional. If the correspondence breaks, the system collapses. Seen through this lens, the caves are not historical accidents later interpreted symbolically. They are nodes in a correspondental grid. Tribes mirror caves, numbers mirror authority, absence mirrors loss, abundance mirrors inheritance. The story does not explain the structure dictates which story survives. The remaining Hermetic principles, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender, operate as secondary regulators. They explain why emphasis alternates, why some caves are loaded while others are silent, why authority oscillates rather than concentrated, bleh, rather than concentrates, and why loss and fullness are staged rather than random. But they are but they all depend on the first two. Without mentalism and correspondence, the rest have no substrate on which to operate. This is why Kabbalistic numerology and Hermetic logic converge so naturally. In both systems, number is not illustrative, it is generative. It produces coherence, it stabilizes memory, it renders authority transmittable across time. To encode history numerically is to make it resilient against contradiction. Such a, such systems do not emerge organically from faith alone, they arise from technique, from an understanding of how symbols govern perception, how reputation governs beliefs, and how structure governs legitimacy. They are not expressions of devotion, but instruments of continuity. To frame it in a more familiar way is, let me make sure this read this right. To frame it in a more familiar way, it is a mimicry of biblical structure where Old Testament stories foreshadow Christ and New Testament events. But this crafted storytelling is in the way a magician subtly sets up the foundation of a trick before the big reveal. It gives the impression of miraculous, but on the contrary, it is nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Within the Dead Sea Scroll narrative was consciously shaped within this framework, or unconsciously inherited through it, remains an open historical question. What is not open is the result. The final form of the story aligns seamlessly with a worldview in which mind precedes matter, structure precedes meaning, and order precedes truth. This chapter does not claim to expose intent, it exposes architecture. Before institutions can be critiqued, the grammar they operate within must be made visible. Before symbols can be decoded, the numerical logic beneath them must be understood. The 12 caves of Qumran do not merely bleh. The 12 caves of Qumran do not merely store text, they enact correspondence. They externalize a mental map. They project an invisible order onto stone, and silence and symbolic maps, especially those grounded in Hermetic logic, are never neutral.